Okay, well, I'll go ahead and begin, and I think what I'll do is we always have somebody introduce the next speaker, and so I'd like to introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is my much older alter ego, Herb Marsh, so I don't think I'll say anything more about him, but it is interesting because what I'm going to be talking about today is a long history of research, and so this part of my alter ego goes back much further than my research that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so I started off, how did I get into self-concept research? When I first went to move to Sydney in 1979, at that time I led encounter groups and had a little bit of a clinical counseling background, but was mostly in my research. I was a number cruncher and a quantitative, and so I was looking for an area where I could put those two together. And particularly at that time, the quality of research and self-concept was woeful in terms of the rigor of it, and there were some quantitative people that were working in the area, but they didn't know anything about self-concept, and there were a lot of people that knew a lot about self-concept that didn't know anything about research, and particularly not quantitative research. And so I thought, well, I could go ahead and bring those two together, and that sort of methodological substantive synergy is one of the keynotes, one of the critical aspects that has followed me all along. I started off with the Shavelson model, and most of you have already seen this, but I'll just give you a quick overview. So there's general self-concept at the top, and that's divided into academic and non-academic self-concept. The academic is divided into self-concepts in particular areas, and then there's the non-academic. Now, this was a theoretical or a hypothetical model, and in fact there was no evidence of it. At the time, there were no instruments that could verify this, and in fact the belief was that there was only a general self-esteem, or if there were dimensions, they were so highly correlated that they couldn't be distinguished. So it was clearly a problem in the measurement. And so the early part of my work in this area was developing measurement materials. And so here we have the Shavelson model, and my focus was particularly on the academic component. And what we showed was that the correlations among these different academic self-concepts were really quite low. And in fact, if you go to the two ends, the verbal and the math, the correlation was approaching zero. So it obviously made no sense to have a general academic self-concept. And so that was sort of a starting point for some of the research that I did. But more generally, the average correlation among the self-concepts was 0.1, 0.15 across the different instruments. So clearly, from going from a place where there was claimed to be a unidimensional, clearly that wasn't the case. And so that was a breakthrough. It's also an interesting one, too, because the Shavelson, whose work I was piggybacking on, was at UCLA, and his office was probably within 100 meters or so of my office when I was a graduate student and early career person at UCLA, and I never actually met him. And it wasn't until I came to Australia and started working in self-concept that I started working together with him. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about frame of reference effects, and particularly the IE model and the big fish little pond effect. And so the IE model follows from that initial finding that the math and verbal self-concepts are nearly uncorrelated. And so why would that possibly be? And so what I did is I came up with the IE model, and the IE model says that verbal achievement and verbal self-concept are highly related, and math and achievement and math self-concept are highly related, but the cross paths are actually negative. So in order to have a good math self-concept, I have to have good math skills, but I have to have much better math skills than verbal skills, because in some sense I compare my verbal skills, or my math skills, to my verbal skills, and if the verbal skills are too good, that detracts from my math self-concept. And so we were able to show, and this is one of these interesting paradoxes that come up when you start looking at the frame of reference effects. And frame of reference effects actually was the basis of my PhD, but with psychophysics stimuli, with the sound of how loud tones were and how heavy lifted weights were and things like that. So, but the same frame of reference model kinds of things that I've continued to use that. So this is a very interesting frame of reference effect. And this is data based on PISA with lots of different countries from all over the world. And so the results were quite consistent with what we had found in individual studies. The cross paths were negative, the horizontal paths were positive. So there was good generalizability. And in another presentation, I might argue about how good national studies may be stronger for looking at universality than meta-analysis, but that's another story. We'll go on from that. Now, an interesting issue has come up. My colleagues from Kiel have taken my work and relabeled it. At least initially they included me in it, but subsequently they've taken many of the models that I've come up with and put another name on them and started claiming them as their own. This is a really nice one because the dimensional comparison theory was something that Jens Muller came up with, and it was we worked on that together, and so that was fine. And basically what it's saying is that the IE model is looking at math achievement and verbal achievement. And so what we're asking is what happens for the ones that are in between. And so the effects here are what's called contrast effects, so that individual verbal achievement has a negative effect on math self-concept. That's called a contrast effect. What we were saying is that there's a gradation, so that this is the most positive, and this is the most negative, and that other domains will fall in line with that. So that's an interesting one. Now, we haven't tested. We've tested with lots of different subjects, and they sort of work that way. And the ordering of the subjects was a lot. That was the original rationale for the ordering of the subjects, and it works out pretty well. Now, we haven't played with the IE model too much outside of academia, outside of the academic subject, but I'm sure that it applies other places as well. And one place where we had some preliminary data where it was very clear was in sports psychology. So we were looking at individual medley swimmers. And so an outstanding swimmer may be world-class in whatever their weakest stroke is. And even though they're world-class, their self-concept in that stroke would be relatively low because it's their weakest stroke. So I'm sure there's other examples too, but our research has always been in the academic area. Okay, now let me move on to the big fish, little pond effect. And this has just been a wonderfully heuristic area of research for me. So this was a very early study, 1984, and it wasn't a very good study, but the results were pretty clear. So we had academic ability, not surprisingly, has a positive effect on academic self-concept. But the interesting bit is that school average ability has a negative effect on academic self-concept. And yes.
Herb, I was just wondering.
Yeah.
Exactly what role did Phil Parker play on this paper?
Well, let me see if I can think. I don't know where that came from. It was obviously another party. How old were you in 1984?
He's always been smart, our boy.
John Parker was a school principal in the Wollongong area who was doing a master's degree. So this was a tiny study. It was, I think it was only a couple of schools and whatever. It provided the basis of looking at. So then the next study that we did was with a much larger American study with 88 high schools, and the results were so close that it's really quite amazing. I mean, it's incredibly fortuitous. It's just good luck that the results were that close, but nevertheless. And then we've gone on and done this big fish little pond effect all over the place. And these are 3 rounds, 3 waves of PISA data that pretty much all support the big fish little pond effect. And there's a more recent round that we've looked at as well. So we've now got 4 waves of PISA data, and almost every individual country supports the big fish little pond effect. And we're arguing, and some people accept it and some people don't, that this is probably one of the most universal findings in psychology. You just don't get this sort of cross-national generalizability in many findings anywhere else, and particularly for something that's paradoxical, and particularly something in education, because education systems around the world are so different, and yet it pretty much generalizes across, with the exception of Korea, where the results are non-significant. And I don't know about that. I had a Korean student who said something about the head of the dragon and the tail of the dragon in Korea was the head was more important than the tail, or something like that. I didn't quite understand where that fit in, but I would be interested in knowing why and whether that's still the case. I'm not sure why it is. Koreans are very interesting. They also, because their academic self-concept is almost an outlier relative to the rest of the world. So it might be something to do with that as well.
You mean high or low?
Low.
Yeah, I understand.
Almost a standard deviation below the next lowest.
And this is North, South Korea, both?
Huh?
Which Korea?
Sure, South Korea. I doubt it. Now, the next model that, not necessarily in order, but is the reciprocal effects model. And this is one of those chicken-egg questions. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? And so the causal ordering model that I developed for this, not that I developed the model, but I applied it here, was you've got multiple indicators of self-concept, multiple indicators of achievement, and a couple of waves of data. And the critical question is, what are the cross paths? That's the self-enhancement that says that self-concept leads to good performance. And that's the skill development that says that performance leads to good self-concept. Now, we know that self-concept is substantially based upon achievement. So the red paths the red paths aren't surprising or anything like that. But the critical ones are the blue paths. Are there actually? Oh my goodness! Look at these arrows have gotten out of the line over time. In any case, the critical one are the blue paths. And so we were able to show that there's a reciprocal effect and that both the red paths and the blue paths were significant. It depends. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I guess it's probably whether the computer has sound turned on. Okay, so there's now been meta-analyses showing that the reciprocal effect, in fact there's 2 meta-analyses and maybe a third that's in a beginning stage that somebody sent us a copy of. But this reciprocal effects model is now well established, so that it's very clear that self-concept contributes to a good achievement as well as being caused by good achievement. Okay, so what I've been working on recently is putting all these together into what I call a cube model. Now, in the broader psychological literature, there's psychological comparison processes. And the two major comparison processes, probably the most widely known is social comparison. So how do I compare with others around me? And the big fish, little pond effect is clearly that. Now the temporal comparison is how do I compare with what I've done in the past? And that's sort of the reciprocal effect model. Not exactly, but it's sort of the reciprocal effect model that I've talked about before. And then what we're arguing is that the dimensional comparison is another whole process, but it's important as well. And so this is putting the three together. So these are, this is a quick review of what I just talked about. So these are the three models, the IE model, the internal frame of reference, the big fish, little pond effect, and the reciprocal effects model. Now, here's quite a remarkable study that I did in combination with half the people in the room, or at least a number of the people in my room, and Reinhard Peckrin. It was his Palma database that he put together. It's really quite a remarkable database. So he had limited but some information from year 4, which was before people went into secondary school, and then 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. These are the 5 years of compulsory secondary school at that time in Germany. And I was able to test all three of these models in a single structural equation model. So I was able to test all of the different effects in one model. Obviously, I started doing each of them separately. So there was the IE model, was the path from forth. Okay, that's too much word. So the IE model is the math grades were positive, the German grades were negative. That's not all of the IE model, but it's clearly the IE model was supported by that aspect. And then, of course, we could look at the IE model and how it reverberated over time, and whether those effects lasted over time, which they did. Then there was the big fish, little pond effect, and that was the effect of math grade on self-concept and the effect of school average math on self-concept. So that was the big fish, little pond effect. And then the temporal comparison was math self and math grade over time. And of course, looking at over time and also looking at grades versus tests. So it was a very heuristic study to be able to put all of those together. And it was, it was quite interesting for me to be able to figure out how to get M+ to do the multi-level model that included all three of those comparison effects into a single model. Now, this is Geeth's early attempt to try and draw the cube model, where there's the social comparison, the dimensional comparison, and the temporal comparison. And I'm sort of in the process now of trying to see how far I can push it, whether I can call this this cube model, whether that actually holds together, or whether it's just a way of talking about the three different models, whether there's some, but obviously there's some new things that come out of the cube model by putting together the different ones. So we've got some extensions here. One of the things that we've come up with that's kind of interesting is that country average math achievement has a negative effect on individual student math achievement. So students that score the same PISA score in a high, in Singapore, for example, or a country where the math achievement is high, will have a lower self-concept than they will in a country where the math self-concept is low. And that was presented as the paradoxical cross-cultural effect, because people were looking at it in isolation. But if you look at it within the context of the frame of reference model, it's just a simple extension of the big fish, little pond effect. Now, it's not saying that students actually know how their country compares with other countries, but the frame of reference that is established relative to their country. And students mostly know how they compare with other students in their school, and mostly know how their school compares with other schools. But they will have some sense of what's average in their country. They don't have to know that the average is above or below other countries. All they have to do is kind of know what's average in their country. So that was an interesting extension. And this was a little literature in the paradoxical cultural effect. And this doesn't explain all of it, but it explains at least some of it. It's interesting to be able to take this theoretical model and come up with an explanation for this paradoxical effect. I mean, all the frame of reference effects that I'm working with are paradoxical. The fact that going to a selective school has a negative effect on self-concept is paradoxical. The fact that verbal achievement has a negative effect on math's self-concept is paradoxical. And this is paradoxical. Another area that's a little tangential but sort of fits in with this is something called the red shirting or relative year in school effect. And again, I've worked in collaboration with lots of people in our group on this. Now, red shirting comes from an American expression in American universities. If you come in with an athletic scholarship, let's say you're a superstar quarterback, but the team already has really good quarterbacks that are in their last year at university, they will redshirt you. That means they will hold you out, so you won't compete in official games. And so that gives you an extra year of eligibility. And for some reason, the people that are redshirted wear red shirts during practice, so they're distinguished from the others. So this is called red shirting. And so what we looked at here is that being old for your year in school has a positive effect on self-concept. And it's not just academic self-concept. I mean, it's also social self-concept and physical self-concept. There's lots of advantages for being old and relatively older in relative to your classmates. And as a consequence of this, I think I read that in the U.S. that something like a quarter of middle-class kids are held back a year because some middle-class parents are onto this. Now, what we're looking at that's much more controversial is that we're also looking at the effects of repeating a year in school. And both of them mean you're old relative to your year, but the current belief is that one of them is quite reasonable and one of them is terrible, but we showed that the effects were pretty much the same for both of them. So both of them were relative year in school. This is an interesting one. This has gotten a little screwed up, but okay, so this is the integration of social and dimensional comparison. So the dimensional comparison is the IE model, and that's at level 1. And so it says that math achievement has a positive effect, and verbal achievement is the opposite direction, it has a negative effect. So we looked at what happens at level 2. So at level 2, we know that the big fish, little pond effect is that math achievement has a negative effect. So applying that logic, verbal achievement should have a positive effect. And we've got some evidence that that's happening in a couple of different studies, and certainly we were able to show it with a big PISA study. So there is some generalizability. It's hard to get that because the school average math and school average verbal achievement are so highly correlated that there's a lot of multicollinearity, but there's clearly some evidence of that. And it's another of these sort of ironic things. Going to an academically selective magnet school in mathematics and science will reduce my math self-concept, but it will have a somewhat positive effect on my verbal self-concept. So we call this the compensatory big fish little pond effect. Now, I'm just about out of time, but I'll just explore a couple of places where I've been going with this. And next time there's a gap in the brown bag seminar program, I'll probably talk a little bit more about some of these studies. The first of these is looking at the effect at school type effects. And so there's just a huge literature on single-sex versus co-ed, private versus public, academic selective versus non-selective. And the PISA database is a really interesting one because they've got all these school types and they've got them cross-nationally. And so I thought it would be really interesting to put this together to look at, to add school type as an L2 variable to the type of things that we're doing. And it's a little bit disappointing because essentially there are no school effects, at least for the self-concept areas. Single-sex versus co-ed doesn't make any difference. Public versus private doesn't make any difference. Academically selective versus non-selective doesn't make any difference. I mean, all the effect sizes are well under 0.1. And that generalizes to self-concept and self-efficacy and interest and utility. So there's not a lot there. Psychology doesn't like null findings to any extent, but nevertheless it's interesting. But one of the things that really did come out that was interesting, we've sort of seen this before, but for some reason it caught my attention here, and it was really quite interesting in that girls have dramatically lower math self-concepts than boys. They have slightly lower math achievement than boys, but there's the gender gap for the self-concept is much bigger. Girls have much higher verbal self-concepts than boys. The gender gap in verbal achievement, the gender gap in verbal achievement is much bigger, more than double the size of the gender gap in math achievement. Now, when you control the gender difference in math self-concept, this negative effect, when you control that for math achievement, it goes down a little bit, but not much. So it goes down from roughly 0.3 to 0.25-ish, something like that. So that's really quite surprising that it doesn't go down that much. But what is really surprising is that when you have verbal achievement, the gender difference goes down to 0.05. So it almost wipes it out. And so the argument, at least based on the PISA data and generalizable across countries, is that the gender gap in girls' self-concept is more a function of their wonderful verbal skills than their poor math skills. And although it seems a strange finding, it follows straightforward from the logic of the IE model. So verbal achievement has a negative effect on math self-concept, and girls are much better at verbal achievement. So a lot of that low math self-concept is that they're so much better at the verbal skills than the math skills. Interesting one. There are some interesting bits of the single-sex co-ed. There were some hint that girls were somewhat advantaged relative to boys in single sex. They still were low, but they weren't quite as low as they were. The gender difference was not as big as it was in the public schools. But then when you started controlling for background variables, even that disappeared. And I haven't quite figured out why, but it seems like girls going to single-sex schools probably are brighter relative to the population than boys going to single-sex schools. Haven't quite worked that one out yet, but that's a possible one. Then the other one, this is a fairly esoteric one. There's something called the gender equity paradox. This finding is that gender differences are bigger in countries where there's more gender equality, which is backwards. So if a country increases, if you take this as a causal finding, which you shouldn't because it's correlational, it would imply that increasing gender equality will increase the gender gap. And so that just didn't make any sense at all. But it's very popular, it's very trendy now. And so we were able to show that it's an artifact of the way gender equality is measured, and it's also an artifact of not controlling for SES and achievement. And so when we looked at the models and embedded it into the self-concept kind of stuff, the paradox disappeared, and there wasn't much support for the opposite, but nevertheless there was a little bit of support for the opposite and no support for the gender equity. And so that was an extension of the cube model and embedding this within the cube model. So that's all that I've got to talk about now. That one's a little later. So, so I guess that the difference between this and that is about the same as the difference between that and this. Okay, thank you very much. Now, you'll be quite intrigued. I mean, it's quite fascinating to me that this frame of reference effect that was the basis of my PhD thesis. And then I went and did other things, and eventually, not all that long, came back to that. And it's quite fascinating how heuristic that has been in terms of the research that I'm doing. I've only presented this from the substantive perspective, but I had the luxury of being able to work with some of the really top people in the world in the multi-level modeling stuff, and to make advances in this, at least within a psychological framework of the application of multi-level models, because I had such interesting questions. And so these interesting questions about the big fish little pond effect drove my quantitative work in multi-level modeling. And then I went and started talking to other people, and they were fascinated because, I mean, the big fish little pond effect is a really fascinating application of multi-level modeling. The, quote, same construct achievement has a positive effect at L1 and a negative effect at L2, and it makes it very clear why it's important to look at things from a multi-level sort of perspective. And so, although I'm presenting the substantive side of my research, almost all of my research is this substantive methodological synergy, where I balance the two off. Some of my research is primarily methodological, oftentimes using substantive questions, sometimes using simulated data, but still to address questions that came from my substantive research. Okay, thanks. Questions? Yeah.
With the slide with the internal sum of reference, you had the horizontal ones that were positive and the diagonal ones that were negative. What were your findings on the vertical ones?
The vertical ones, the achievements are very highly correlated, and the self-concepts are nearly uncorrelated. And the self-concepts are uncorrelated, are even more uncorrelated if you control for achievement differences. So the self-concept, the math and verbal self-concepts are almost uncorrelated with each other. And whereas the achievements are highly correlated, so it makes it clear that something's happening with the self-concept above and beyond just the achievements. Yes?
I really like self-concept as a dependent measure, as an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Makes a great variable. Well, what are your thoughts on it as a predictor, as a causal variable to contribute to?
Self-concept predicts long-term educational attainment better than achievements. I think, therefore, I tend to choose to do what I think I'm good at. So if I'm good at something, I tend to look at. I had an interesting realization of that as a teenager. I wasn't very good at any sports, but I was reasonably good at a lot of sports. And as I got older, what I realized was that all the people that were sort of okay at a sport but not good, they weren't there anymore. And the only other people that continued to do each of the different sports that I was involved in were the ones that were as good and oftentimes better than me. And so people tend to choose to do what they think they're good at. So self-concept plays an important role in terms of choice behavior.
Do you think that's some of the explanation of why it has a reciprocal effect on later achievement? I can't really understand how a belief can create achievement.
Well, obviously there has to be a process that's in between. But I tend to, I will tend to do things that I like. And it's important to me to be good at things that that I identify and value. But Phil would probably give you a counter perspective, or at least a devil's advocate perspective on that issue. Maybe? No.
I mean, the meta-analysis stuff says that the links going from self-concept to achievement is much, much weaker.
Is what?
Is much weaker than the link going the other way.
Oh, yeah. But there also has to be a process that sits between those two.
I think to resolve that controversy, there's still, I don't know if it's settled in your mind, there's still a controversy. And I think you need the process to close the issue, to get everyone to believe that self precedes achievement.
Well, we do have evidence that when you choose courses, you choose to do courses that you think you're good at, and you choose not to do courses. So when you have when you have choice to make in courses, you choose to do. So that's a fairly simplistic process. I mean, obviously, if you're not taking a course.
Did you also want to comment on the causal relation between achievement and self-concept?
Well, that's kind of what we're talking about now. And what we're saying is that that self-concept drives achievement, but there must be a process that happens in between those two. So that even if it is causal, there must be something that mediates that.
I just need you to be convincing, because I'm trying to talk John Marshall into incorporating self-concept enhancement in some of his interventions.
Well, I guess if you can enhance self-concept, that's probably half the battle in coming up with the process. Other questions?
I think what John, if I get what you're saying, if you could show that self-concept predicted later achievement controlling for later effort controlling for prior achievement, that would be convincing.
The effort one's a tricky one. Because there's, there's all these self-handicapping stuff, things like that. And so the whole effort one is kind of a tricky one in relation to self-concept. Andrew Martin's PhD thesis was looking at self-handicapping and so forth, and so that as a way of protecting your self-concept, you either lie and tell people that you didn't study even though you did, or worse yet, you don't study and get drunk the night before a major final exam. So the whole effort one is an interesting one, and that effort issue. We've played around with that a bit, and it's tricky. The course choice is more straightforward.
So maybe there are conditions under which people with high self-concept put forth a lot of effort and translates into achievement, and then there's kind
and
of
and that's what I was able to show. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it depends on
And it's really fascinating to try and unpack a lot of these different constructs, because we've got so many different constructs in psychology, and we've got this thing where each camp focuses on their one, and whether it's any different than how much it overlaps with something else. And so one of my pet peeves is looking at self-concept and self-efficacy, and oftentimes they're the same, and in some cases they might be different depending upon how they're measured and so forth. That's another story. Any other?
Yep, Herb, with the school type effects, the different school types, what about opposite sex and same sex relations? Has that been looked at to differ for the different types of schools?
Not very much. Certainly not with the PISA data.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, we looked at it with the Big Manly study.
Yeah, and did you get any differences for school type?
In the Manly study was a really interesting one. It was very early on in my career, and there was Manly boys and Manly girls, and the two schools decided they wanted to both become co-educational. And so they asked me if I would evaluate the process of the change from single-sex schools to co-educational schools. And I said, sure, that sounds great. And it sounded like a very interesting field study. And then they came back to me about 6 months later and said, we've got terrible news for you. Because there's these external exams that are so critical, we've decided that we don't want to amalgamate all the year groups at once. And so they amalgamated 8, let's see, must have been, I can't remember what it was, but every other year group was left in one, and then the second year they amalgamated. And it was for a quasi-experimental design. You wouldn't have dreamed of asking them to do something so outrageous, and so and the results were really quite interesting. The change from single-sex to co-ed made no difference at all in terms of the achievement scores. The self-concepts for everybody were a bit higher, not dramatically, but a bit higher on a co-ed in the co-ed schools than the single-sex schools, and the advantage for the boys was a little bit higher than the advantage for the girls, but both of them went up not much. Yeah.
And same and opposite sex relations stayed the same?
No, they went up a little bit.
Just a little bit for both?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Other questions?
Sorry, I've got a question. A boss of mine once said that you need a rooster in the hen house to keep the hens from pecking at each other, and you need to throw a hen amongst the roosters to keep them honest. So basically, like, you always need a girl to make sure the boys don't misbehave too badly, and you need a boy to stop the girls from calling each other's hens.
That logic is not entirely inconsistent with my thinking on single-sex and co-ed. My belief is that you ought to have a natural school setting where you have a variety of achievement levels and a variety of you have both boys and girls, and you have a variety of ethnicities, that it represents the population. So what you're talking about is a little more specialized than what I'm talking about, but it's not inconsistent. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, thank you.